I'd worked for Silas Drummond 12 years the day his wife died, and I watched a man who'd once wrestled a half-broke stallion to a standstill in ankle-deep mud fold up like he was made of nothing but paper and rainwater. Alma went in the spring of '68, scarlet fever. It took her in 11 days, and it would have taken the two youngest with her if the doctor from Fort Paxley hadn't ridden through the storm to get there. Silas sat on the porch the morning we buried her, and he didn't cry, and he didn't speak, and when the last neighbor's wagon pulled out of the yard, he went inside and took down every curtain she'd sewn and put them in a trunk and shoved the trunk under the bed. I don't know why the curtains. Maybe because they were the thing he saw her hands on most. Maybe because looking at them was like looking at her standing in the window. That was 2 years before Nessa Calloway stepped off the mail coach in Shallow Creek with a carpetbag in one hand and a letter in the other. 2 years is a long time to watch a man drown on dry land. Silas ran the ranch well enough. He'd always been capable, and capable doesn't leave a man just because grief arrives. The cattle got worked, the hay got cut, the fences got mended. I handled the crew, and between the two of us the Drummond place held. But the house went dark. The kitchen, which Alma had kept so warm you could smell bread from the barn, went cold and stayed cold. Meals were salt pork and beans in silence. The children, Josephine, who was 9, Calvin, who was 7, and little Marguerite, who was 5 and still asked for her mama some mornings. The children grew quieter by the month, and Silas didn't notice because he'd gone quiet himself. I tried to say something once, just once. We were stringing wire on the south pasture, the two of us alone, and I said, "Silas, those kids need more than what you're giving them." He looked at me like I'd spit on his wife's grave. "They need their mother," he said, "and I can't give them that." He wasn't wrong, but he wasn't right either, and I knew it, and he knew I knew it, and we went back to stringing wire, and neither of us said another word about it for 6 months. The parade of hired help started that fall. Silas wouldn't hear of remarrying. I think the idea struck him as a kind of treason, but even he could see that 3 children under 10 needed more than a foreman's rough attention and a father who came in at dark and sat by the fire without speaking. So he put a notice in the Shallow Creek Gazette and on the board outside Crutcher's General Store. Wanted, housekeeper for ranch household. 3 children. Cooking, cleaning, general upkeep. Fair wage. Inquire S. Drummond. The first woman lasted 9 days. She was a widow from Hartfield, sturdy and competent, and she took one look at the state of the kitchen and rolled up her sleeves and went to work. She cooked well. She cleaned well. She could not, however, endure Silas Drummond's silence. On the 9th evening she came to me in the barn and said, "Mr. Pratt, that man has spoken 14 words to me in 9 days. I counted. I am going back to Hartfield where at least the furniture talks to me." And she left on the morning coach. The second woman lasted 3 weeks. She was young, barely 20, the daughter of a shopkeeper in Paxley, and she was cheerful and willing and completely terrified of Calvin, who had taken to climbing everything he could reach, the corral fence, the barn roof, the cottonwood behind the house, and answering every instruction with a flat stare that would have done credit to a hanging judge. She left after Calvin climbed onto the roof of the chicken coop and refused to come down for 4 hours. The third woman lasted 2 days. I never learned why. She simply wasn't there on the 3rd morning, and her things were gone, and Silas said nothing about it. After that the notice stayed up, but nobody answered it for a long while, and the house settled back into its cold silence, and I watched those 3 children try to raise themselves and felt something in my chest that I didn't have a word for. Josephine, who was 10 by then, did the cooking badly, bravely, with a set jaw that reminded me so much of her mother I had to look away sometimes. Calvin went wilder. And Marguerite, little Marguerite, who had her mother's brown eyes and her father's stubbornness, stopped asking for her mama and started going quiet in a way that worried me more than the asking ever had. It was June when the letter arrived. Silas brought it to the barn and read it standing in the doorway with dust motes turning gold around him, and he read it twice, and then he handed it to me without a word. It was written in a clean, precise hand on good paper. It said, "Dear Mr. Drummond, I am writing in response to your posting for a housekeeper, which I found reprinted in the dispatch. My name is Nessa Calloway. I am 26 years of age, unmarried, in good health, and capable of cooking, cleaning, laundering, mending, basic animal tending, and the instruction of children in reading, writing, and arithmetic, having served 4 years as a schoolteacher in Braddock County, Pennsylvania. I lost my position last term due to the closure of the school and have been unable to secure another. I am not afraid of hard work or remote country. If the position remains open, I can arrive in Shallow Creek by the 22nd of June. I require only fair wages and a clean room of my own. Respectfully, Nessa Calloway." I read it twice myself. "A school teacher," I said. "She can cook," Silas said, like that was the beginning and end of it. "She can also read and write and teach your children, which is more than the last 3 combined." He took the letter back and folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. "She's probably 5 feet tall and scared of horses." "You don't know that." "I know school teachers." He wrote back one line I later learned. "Position open, come ahead, S. Drummond." And on the 22nd of June, Gideon Pratt, aged 55, who had seen a great many things in his years on the frontier, stood in the yard of the Drummond Ranch and watched the mail coach from Paxley pull up to the gate, and watched a woman step down who was nothing like what any of us expected. She was tall. That was the first thing. Nearly as tall as Silas, with dark hair pinned up under a plain hat and a face that was, I'll say it plainly, handsome rather than pretty. Strong jaw, level eyes, gray-green, the color of sage after rain. She wore a dark dress, clean but not new, and she carried her carpet-bag like it weighed nothing, and she stood in the dust of the yard and looked at the house and the barn and the sagging porch and the dead garden and the 3 children lined up on the steps staring at her, and she didn't flinch. Didn't smile either. Just looked, the way a person looks at a thing they intend to understand before they speak. Silas came out of the barn wiping his hands on a rag. He stopped 6 feet from her and looked her over and said, "Miss Calloway." "Mr. Drummond." "You can cook." "I can." "The children are Josephine, Calvin, and Marguerite." He pointed at each one without looking at them. "Josephine knows the house. She'll show you what needs doing." "All right." He stood there another moment, like he was waiting for her to say something else, to ask about wages, or the room, or the hours, or the town, and when she didn't, he nodded once and went back to the barn. I watched him go, and I watched Nessa Calloway watch him go, and her face told me nothing at all. But Marguerite's face told me everything. The child had been sitting on the bottom step with her rag doll in her lap, and when Nessa looked down at her, Marguerite looked up with those brown eyes and said, very quietly, "Are you going to stay?" And Nessa Calloway set down her carpetbag and knelt in the dust in her good dress and said, "I intend to." That was the beginning of it. She didn't try to conquer the house all at once. I noticed that. The women before her had come in swinging, scrubbing floors, reorganizing the pantry, rearranging furniture, and it had felt each time like an invasion, and the house had resisted the way a living thing resists a stranger's hands. Nessa worked differently. She started with the kitchen. She spent her first full day just cleaning it, the stove, the table, the shelves, the floor, and by evening the room smelled like soap and cedar, and for the first time in 2 years, something baking. She'd found flour and lard in the pantry and made biscuits, and they were good, and Josephine ate 3 of them and said nothing, and Calvin ate 4 and also said nothing, and Marguerite ate 1 and said, "These taste like Mama's." The table went very quiet. Silas put down his fork and left the room. Nessa watched him go, and then she looked at Marguerite and said gently, "I'm glad they're good." I was eating at the kitchen table that night. I'd taken most of my meals there since Alma's time, and I saw Nessa's face in that moment, and I understood something. She wasn't confused by Silas's leaving. She wasn't hurt by it. She understood it exactly. The way a teacher understands a child who acts out not from cruelty but from a wound too big to name. And she let him go, and she cleared the plates, and she didn't mention it again. The singing started on the third day. I don't know if she planned it. I don't think she did. She was washing dishes at the kitchen window, the morning light coming in gold and full, and she began to hum, and the humming turned into words, low and clear. A song I didn't recognize, something about a river and a house on a hill and coming home. Her voice was, I've heard women sing in churches and parlors, and once at a theater in St. Louis, and none of them sounded like Nessa Calloway sounded standing at that sink with her sleeves rolled up in soap on her wrists. It wasn't a performance. It was the sound of a person whose voice lived inside her the way breath did, and it came out when her hands were busy and her mind was easy, and it filled the room like lamplight fills a dark corner, not by pushing the dark away, but by making you forget it was ever there. Calvin heard it first. He'd been on the porch, whittling a stick with the knife I'd given him against Silas's wishes, and he came to the kitchen door and stood there listening with the knife forgotten in his hand. Then Josephine came down the stairs, barefoot, her book open in her hands, and stopped in the hallway. And Marguerite came and sat on the floor by the stove and hugged her rag doll and closed her eyes. Nessa finished the song without looking at any of them, and she dried a plate, and she said, not turning around, Marguerite, would you like to help me make the bread? And Marguerite got up and went to her and took her hand, and I thought, that's it. That's the thing that's going to change this house. Silas wasn't there to hear it. He was in the south pasture with me, and by the time we came in for supper the singing was done, and the kitchen was just a kitchen again, warm and clean and smelling of bread, and 3 children were sitting at the table with their faces washed and their hair combed, and Silas looked at them like he'd walked into the wrong house. He didn't say anything. He sat down and ate, and he didn't say anything. But I saw him look at the bread, and I saw him look at Josephine's combed hair, and I saw him set his jaw in a way that I knew meant he was fighting something, and I knew what he was fighting, and I kept my mouth shut. The weeks that followed were something to watch if you had the patience for it, and I have always been a patient man. Nessa worked without complaint and without fanfare. She cleaned the house room by room, not rearranging, but restoring, putting things back the way they should have been, the way Alma had kept them. She mended clothes the children had outgrown and let out hems and patched knees. She cooked meals that were plain and good and always hot at the right time. She kept a garden, Alma's garden, which had gone to weeds, and within 3 weeks she had beans coming up and tomatoes staked and herbs along the kitchen wall. And she sang. Every day at some point she sang, washing, gardening, hanging laundry on the line, teaching Marguerite to knead dough. She didn't sing for anyone. She sang the way some people breathe, steady and necessary, and the children drifted toward the sound of it the way calves drift toward their mothers, and no one talked about it, and everyone knew. Josephine was the hardest to reach and the one who needed reaching most. She'd been carrying the household on her thin shoulders for 2 years, and she wasn't ready to put that weight down, because putting it down meant admitting she'd needed help, and admitting she'd needed help meant admitting her father hadn't provided it, and she loved her father. So she watched Nessa with a wariness that bordered on hostility and said very little, and did everything herself even when Nessa offered to help. Nessa didn't push. She simply worked alongside the girl and let the work speak. And one afternoon I came in from the barn and found the 2 of them sitting at the kitchen table with Josephine's reader between them, and Nessa was pointing at a passage and saying something low and thoughtful, and Josephine was listening with an expression on her face that I hadn't seen in 2 years, the expression of a child who is being taught by someone who knows how. Calvin was simpler. Calvin was 7 and angry and full of the kind of restless energy that comes from having no one to direct it. He climbed things. He broke things. He ignored instructions from anyone except me, and he only listened to me because I was old and calm and knew how to wait him out. Nessa handled him the way she handled everything, steadily, without fuss, without raising her voice. She gave him tasks, real tasks, not invented ones. She asked him to split kindling and he did it. She asked him to carry water and he did it. She asked him to help her patch a section of the chicken coop where a fox had been getting in, and he did it. And when they were done, he stood back and looked at the mended wire, and I saw something shift in his face. The satisfaction of a boy who has been useful and knows it. And Marguerite was the one who broke your heart. She followed Nessa everywhere. Not clinging, Marguerite wasn't a clinging child, but close, always close, a small quiet shadow with brown eyes and a rag doll. She helped with the bread. She helped with the garden. She sat on the kitchen floor while Nessa cooked and listened to the singing with her eyes closed. And sometimes she sang along, softly, in a voice so small and clear that it took a moment to realize it was there. I came around the corner of the house one evening about 3 weeks in and found them on the porch steps in the late gold light. Nessa was mending a tear in Marguerite's dress, the child still wearing it, holding very still, and she was humming, and Marguerite had her head against Nessa's arm and her eyes were closed. It was such a small thing. A needle and thread and a hummed melody and a child leaning against a woman's arm. But I stood there in the shadow of the house, and I felt my throat go tight because I'd seen Alma do exactly that, sit on those same steps with a needle and a child and a song. And the house had that same feel again, that same warmth, that same aliveness that had gone out of it the morning we put Alma in the ground. And I knew, standing there, that Silas was going to have to reckon with it. He wasn't blind. A blind man couldn't have run that ranch. He saw the changes, the clean house, the mended clothes, the fed children, the garden coming back to life. He saw his children at supper with their faces washed and their lessons done and something in their eyes that hadn't been there before. He saw all of it, and he said nothing, and he fought it with every stubborn bone in his body. I understood why. Letting Nessa matter meant letting Alma go, and letting Alma go meant admitting that life continued without her, and admitting that life continued without her felt like a betrayal of everything he'd loved. So he stayed silent. He came in late and left early. He spoke to Nessa only about the house. The stove needs blacking, the root cellar door sticks, there's flour at Crutcher's on the Drummond account, and he never once said her food was good or the house looked better or the children seemed happier. Never once. Nessa bore it with a patience that would have shamed a saint. She didn't push. She didn't complain. She didn't seek his approval or his conversation. She did her work and she cared for his children and she sang in the kitchen. And if Silas Drummond wanted to live in his own house like a boarder who'd rather be somewhere else, that was his business. But I could see it wearing on her. Not the silence itself. I think she'd expected the silence. What wore on her was the wall it put between her and the children. Because the children watched their father, the way children always watch their father, and they saw that he kept his distance from this woman, and it confused them. Josephine, who was old enough to understand more than she should have had to, started pulling back, not from Nessa exactly, but from the ease of Nessa, from the warmth of her, as if getting too close would be a disloyalty to the grief her father carried. Calvin went back to climbing things, and Marguerite kept close, kept singing along, kept leaning against Nessa's arm, but there was a worry in her eyes now, the worry of a child who has found something good and is waiting for it to be taken away. I tried to talk to Silas about it one more time. We were in the barn, late, rubbing down the horses after a long day moving cattle to the summer pasture. The light was going. I could hear Nessa singing somewhere in the house, faint through the walls, and the sound carried across the yard like smoke. "She's good with them," I said. Silas said nothing. "Better than good. Josephine's reading again. Calvin hasn't been on the roof in 2 weeks. Marguerite." I know what Marguerite does. His voice was quiet and tight, and I knew I was on dangerous ground. "Then you know you've got something in that house that doesn't come along twice." He set the brush down and looked at me, and in the failing light his face was so full of pain that I almost wished I hadn't spoken. "She's a hired woman, Gideon. She cooks and cleans, and she'll move on when something better turns up, and those children will lose someone else. You understand that? They'll lose someone else. Or they won't. They will. Everyone leaves or everyone dies, and either way the children are the ones left standing in the yard watching the road." I didn't have an answer for that. Not because he was right, he wasn't, but because the kind of wrong he was came from a place so deep and so hurt that no words of mine were going to reach it. So I finished with the horses and I went to my bunk and I lay in the dark and listened to the silence and I thought, something's going to have to break. It was Marguerite who almost broke it. Late July, hot and dry, the kind of heat that makes the grass crackle and the creek run thin. Silas and I were working the fence line on the north pasture, a good 3 miles from the house, and we'd been out since dawn. About mid-afternoon I saw Calvin riding toward us on the old mare, riding hard, and the way he sat the horse told me something was wrong before he was close enough to speak. He pulled up in a cloud of dust and said, "Marguerite fell." Silas was on his horse before Calvin finished the sentence. I followed. We rode hard, and the 3 miles felt like 30, and the whole ride Silas didn't say a word but his face was white. She'd fallen from the cottonwood behind the house. The big one with the low limbs that Calvin had climbed 100 times, and Marguerite, who had apparently decided she was big enough to follow her brother, had gone up 10 feet and come down hard on her arm. Nessa had her on the kitchen table when we got there, and the scene I walked into stopped me in the doorway. Marguerite was crying, quiet crying, the kind that's worse than screaming because it means the child is trying to be brave and can't quite manage it. Her left arm was bent wrong below the elbow. Nessa had already splinted it, 2 flat sticks and strips of torn cloth, neat and tight, and she was holding the child against her with one arm and wiping her face with a damp cloth with the other, and she was singing. Low and steady, not a performance, not a show of calm, just the sound that meant safety to this child, and Marguerite was listening to it the way a drowning person listens to the voice that says hold on. Silas came through the door like a storm. He crossed the room in 2 strides and took Marguerite off the table and held her against his chest, and the child cried harder, and he looked at her arm and then he looked at Nessa. "She fell from the cottonwood," Nessa said, "about an hour ago. The arm's broken, a clean break, I think, below the elbow. I set the splint and kept her still. She needs the doctor." "Where were you when she fell?" The question landed like a slap. Nessa's face didn't change, but I saw her hands go still, and I saw her draw a breath. "In the garden, 15 feet away. I heard the branch crack and caught her before she hit the ground fully. Her arm struck the root, but her head didn't touch. I was there, Mr. Drummond." Silas stared at her for a long moment, and I could see the war in him. The fear, the anger, the need to blame someone because blaming someone was easier than admitting that children fall and arms break, and the world is full of cottonwood trees and gravity, and there is no one on earth who can watch a 5-year-old every second of every day. I saw all of that cross his face, and I saw Nessa see it too, and I saw her wait. "I'll ride for the doctor," I said, because someone had to break the silence, and Silas nodded without looking at me, and I rode for Shallow Creek. Doc Hadley came back with me, set the arm properly, said Nessa's splint had been as good as anything he could have done in the field, and left with the observation that the child was lucky the woman had been close enough to break the worst of the fall. Silas heard this and said nothing. That night I sat on the bunk porch and smoked and watched the house. The lamp was on in Marguerite's room, and I could see Nessa's shadow moving behind the curtain, and I could hear her singing, just barely, across the yard, and I thought, he's going to drive her away. He's going to do to those children exactly the thing he's afraid of, and he's going to do it with his own 2 hands, and he's going to call it protecting them. 3 days later, Nessa came to the barn at dawn. I was already up, saddling my horse for the day's work, and she came through the wide door with her shawl pulled around her shoulders, and her face set in a way I'd come to recognize calm and decided, and absolutely immovable. "Mr. Pratt," she said. "Miss Calloway, I'm going to leave at the end of the week." I stopped with the cinch half tightened and looked at her. "Why?" "Because I'm doing more harm than good." "That's not true, and you know it. Mr. Drummond does not want me here." "Mr. Drummond doesn't know what he wants. He hasn't known for 2 years." She looked at me, and for the first time I saw the tiredness behind the calm, the weariness of a woman who had given everything she had to a house and 3 children, and a man who would not let himself be reached. "I can bear the silence," she said. "I've been poor and I've been alone, and I've taught in a schoolroom where the roof leaked on every child's head and the school board told me it built character. I can bear a great deal, Mr. Pratt, but I cannot bear being the reason those children are confused. They don't know what I am to them. Their father won't let me be anything, and they can feel it, and it's making them uncertain. And uncertain is worse than what they had before I came, because at least before they weren't waiting to lose something." I stood there with my hand on the cinch, and I wanted to argue, but she was right. She was exactly right, and the rightness of it sat in my chest like a stone. "Does he know?" I asked. "I'll tell him tonight. Give me 1 day." She looked at me. "Mr. Pratt, 1 day. That's all I'm asking. Something's got to break, Miss Calloway, and if you walk out that gate before it does, those 3 children will be worse off than they were before you came, and you know it as well as I do." She stood there for a long time, and the light was coming up behind her, and I could see the dust motes turning in it, and I could see her thinking. Then she nodded once and went back to the house. I didn't go to the south pasture that morning. I found Silas in the tack room, mending a bridle, and I stood in the doorway and said, "She's leaving at the end of the week." His hand stopped. "Miss Calloway, she's leaving. She told me this morning." He didn't look up. "She say why?" "Because you won't let her stay. I hired her. She's got a wage and a room and—" "You know what I mean." He set the bridle down, and his hands were shaking, and I'd never seen Silas Drummond's hands shake. Not when the stallion threw him and broke his collarbone. Not when the barn caught fire in '66. Not when Alma, not even then. But they were shaking now. "Gideon," he said, and his voice was rough and low, and I had to lean in to hear it. "I can't." "Can't what?" "I can't do it again. I can't let someone into that house, into those children, and then lose them. I buried 1 woman. I won't bury another, and I won't watch my children bury another. And if that means the house stays cold, then the house stays cold." "It doesn't stay cold, Silas. That's what you're not seeing. It's already warm." She warmed it. "Those children are eating real food and reading real books and laughing. Calvin laughed yesterday. Did you hear it? And Marguerite sings. She didn't sing for 2 years, and now she sings along with that woman in the kitchen. And if you think sending Nessa Calloway down the road is going to make the house cold again, you're wrong. It's going to make it something worse than cold. It's going to make it a place where your children learn that good things come and go, and their father is the one who let them go." I'd said more in 60 seconds than I usually say in a week. Silas looked at me, and I looked at him, and we were 2 old men. Well, he wasn't old, but he'd aged 10 years in 2, standing in a tack room that smelled of leather and dust, and something that might have been grief letting go. He didn't answer me. He picked up the bridle and went back to mending it, and I left. I didn't know if anything I'd said had landed. You can talk to a stone all day and it stays a stone. But I'd seen his hands shake, and I'd seen his face when I told him she was leaving, and I knew the stone had a crack in it, and I knew the crack went deep. The rest of that day passed the way days pass on a ranch when something's coming and you can't hurry it. I worked. I checked the cattle. I mended a gate hinge. I watched the house from the corner of my eye, and I saw Nessa hanging laundry on the line with Marguerite beside her, the child's arm in a sling, helping with 1 hand, and I heard them singing around, Nessa's voice carrying the melody and Marguerite's small voice a beat behind, both of them concentrating and both of them smiling. And I thought about everything I'd said to Silas and everything I hadn't said, and I hoped I'd said enough. Evening came, supper came. I ate at the kitchen table the way I always did, and the food was good. Roasted chicken with potatoes and early beans from the garden. And the children were at the table, and Silas was at the head of it, silent as always, eating without tasting. And Nessa served the food and sat at the other end and ate with the quiet economy of a woman who doesn't waste motion or time. Josephine was talking. That was the thing I noticed. Josephine, who had gone so quiet in the last month, pulling back from Nessa the way her father pulled back, was talking, telling Calvin about a passage in the book she was reading, something about a ship and a whale, her voice animated and her eyes bright. Calvin was pretending not to be interested and failing. Marguerite was eating one-handed and watching Nessa with those brown eyes. And Silas was watching all of them, not the food, not the wall, his children. He was watching his children, and I saw his face and I saw the crack widen. After supper, Nessa cleared the plates and began washing up, and Marguerite went to her usual spot on the floor by the stove, and Josephine opened her book at the table, and Calvin went to the porch. Silas sat in his chair by the fire, which he hadn't lit because it was summer, and he stared at the cold hearth, and the house settled into its evening quiet. Then Nessa began to sing. I don't know the song. I never learned its name. It was slow and low, and I think it was about a home, about leaving and coming back. About a door left open and a lamp left burning and someone waiting at the end of a long road. Her voice filled the kitchen the way it always did, warm and steady, not asking for anything, not performing, just present, the way a fire is present, or a heartbeat. Marguerite closed her eyes and leaned against the stove. Josephine stopped reading and looked up from her book, and there were tears on her face, and she didn't wipe them away. And Silas turned his head from the cold hearth and looked toward the kitchen, and I saw it happen. I saw the thing I'd been waiting 2 years to see. I saw the wall come down. Not all at once. Silas Drummond wasn't a man for dramatic collapses, but in the way his face changed slowly, the way dawn changes a landscape, the hardness softening, the set jaw easing, the eyes losing their distance and gaining something else, something I'll call recognition. He recognized what was in his house. He recognized what that voice meant. He recognized what those children's faces looked like when they listened to it, and he recognized, finally, after 2 years of ice and silence and curtains packed away, that Alma would have wanted this. That Alma, who had loved this house and these children with every breath in her body, would have stood in that kitchen and heard that voice and said, "Yes, this is what they need." He got up from his chair. I held my breath. He walked to the kitchen doorway and he stood there, and Nessa saw him and the song trailed off, and she said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "Don't stop," he said. His voice was rough, the way a gate sounds when it opens after being shut too long. "The children like it," he said. "They've liked it since the first day." Nessa looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them moved, and the kitchen was very quiet. "So do I," he said. And then he went out through the porch door and into the dark yard, and I heard his boots on the packed earth, and I heard him stop somewhere near the cottonwood, and I heard nothing after that. But something had changed. Something had cracked all the way through, and the water was coming in, and there was no stopping it now. The next morning Silas was at the breakfast table before the children. I came in from the barn and found him sitting there with a cup of coffee, and Nessa was at the stove. And there was a quality to the silence between them that was different from every silence before. Not the silence of a man who won't speak to the woman in his house, but the silence of two people who have recognized each other and don't yet know what to say. He ate his breakfast. He said, "The biscuits are good." 3 words, but Nessa's hand paused on the skillet and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Drummond," and her voice was steady, but there was something in it, something careful and warm, and I looked at my plate and kept my mouth shut. Over the next few days, I watched Silas Drummond do something I'd never seen him try. He came in for supper on time instead of late. He sat at the table and he listened to Josephine talk about her book, and he asked Calvin about the fence work, and he let Marguerite climb into his lap with her sling and her rag doll. He spoke to Nessa, not much, but more than 14 words in 9 days. He asked her where she'd taught in Pennsylvania. He asked her about the garden. He told her the stove damper stuck if you didn't kick the left side, which she already knew because she'd been kicking it for 6 weeks. But she thanked him as though it were the most useful information she'd ever received. And he listened when she sang. Not from the cold hearth anymore, but from the doorway or the porch or the table where he sat with the account book open and his pen still. He listened, and the hardness in his face softened, and I watched it the way you watch a field after the first good rain, not all at once, but greening. Nessa didn't change. That was the thing. She didn't become warmer or softer or more hopeful now that Silas had cracked the door. She stayed exactly who she was: steady, capable, proud, kind without asking for credit, singing without asking for an audience. She didn't reach for him. She let the door stay where it was, cracked, and she went about her work, and if Silas Drummond wanted to come through it, that was his to decide. I admired that. I admired it enormously. Most people, given a crack in a wall they'd been pushing against, would push harder. Nessa Calloway stepped back and waited, and the waiting was the bravest thing I watched her do. It was a Sunday, early August, the heat broken by a storm the night before, the world washed clean and cool when the moment came. I know this because I was there. I was on the barn porch mending a harness which gave me a clear line of sight to the house, and I saw it all. Nessa had done the washing that morning and hung it on the line, and she'd swept the porch and watered the garden. And now she was sitting on the front steps with Marguerite beside her, teaching the child to braid a piece of rope. Marguerite's arm was out of the sling by then. Doc Hadley had said the bone was set clean and healing fast, and she worked the rope with both hands, tongue between her teeth, concentrating hard. Josephine was on the porch with her book, and Calvin was whittling on the rail, and the whole scene looked like something a painter would have set up if a painter had come through Shallow Creek, which none ever did. Silas came out of the house. He'd been at his desk, I think, the accounts, or a letter, or just sitting, I didn't know. He came through the door and stopped. He looked at Nessa on the steps. He looked at Marguerite beside her. He looked at the rope braid and the concentration on the child's face and the patience on the woman's, and he stood there in the doorway with his hands at his sides, and I saw something come over him that I can only describe as surrender. Not the weak kind. The kind that takes more courage than fighting. The decision to stop holding the door shut and let the thing in that you've been afraid of because the last time you let it in, it was taken away. He came down the steps. He sat down on the other side of Marguerite. He didn't say anything for a while. He just sat there, the three of them on the steps in the morning light, and the silence was the good kind now, the kind that holds instead of walls. Then Marguerite looked up at him and said, "Papa, Miss Calloway is teaching me to braid." "I see that. She can do a 4-strand. That's something." "Papa." "Yes, Marguerite." "Is Miss Calloway going to stay?" The same question she'd asked the first day, standing on the bottom step with her rag doll. The same brown eyes. But this time she wasn't asking a stranger. She was asking about someone she knew, someone she trusted, someone whose voice she sang along with every morning, and the question wasn't a child's curiosity, it was a child's plea. Silas looked at Nessa. Nessa looked at her hands. "That's up to Miss Calloway," Silas said. "It is not," Nessa said quietly, and she looked up and met his eyes, and I swear the air between them went still the way air goes still before lightning. "It is up to you, Mr. Drummond. It has always been up to you." There it was, the truth of it, laid out on the steps of a ranch house on a Sunday morning by a woman who had borne his silence and his coldness and his grief for 6 weeks without complaint, and who was not going to pretend, in front of his child, that the power in this house belonged to anyone but him. Silas held her gaze. The moment stretched. I gripped the harness in my hands and didn't breathe. "Stay," he said, "please." Nessa said nothing. Not as a housekeeper. His voice was rough and halting, and every word sounded like it cost him something. I'm not good at this, Miss Calloway. I've been a fool and a coward, and I've let my grief make this house into something my wife would have been ashamed of. But my children need you. And he stopped. He looked at Marguerite, who was watching him with enormous eyes, and he looked at Josephine on the porch, who had closed her book, and he looked at Calvin, who had stopped whittling and was holding the knife like he'd forgotten what it was for. "I'd like you to stay," he said, "if you're willing." Nessa Calloway looked at this man, this stubborn, grief-hardened, infuriating, loyal, broken-open man, and she didn't smile. She didn't cry. She didn't throw her arms around him. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the house the first day, with those level gray-green eyes that intended to understand a thing before they committed to it, and she said, "I'm willing, Mr. Drummond." Marguerite dropped the rope braid and grabbed Nessa's hand with both of hers, and she held on, and she looked at her father and said, "Don't let her leave, Papa." And Silas Drummond, who had wrestled stallions and built fences and buried his wife and carried his grief like a second skeleton inside his body for 2 years, looked at his youngest daughter holding a schoolteacher's hand on the steps of his ranch house, and he said, "I won't." That was a Sunday in August. By October they were married. Now I want to be clear about something, because the telling of a thing can make it sound simpler than it was. Silas didn't become a different man overnight. He didn't wake up the next morning spouting poetry and handing out flowers. He was still Silas, gruff, quiet, more comfortable with a fence post than a sentence. But the wall was down, and what came through it day by day was the man Alma had married, the man I'd known for 12 years before grief buried him. Decent, loyal, stubborn in the good way, and capable of a tenderness that surprised you every time because it came wrapped in such a rough package. He fixed the porch. That was the first thing he did after that Sunday morning, and I mention it because it mattered. The porch had been sagging for a year and a half, and he'd let it sag because fixing it felt like admitting the house still needed tending, and admitting the house still needed tending meant admitting life went on. He fixed it in 2 days, planed the board smooth, and put a coat of linseed oil on the railing, and when he was done Nessa came out and ran her hand along the rail and said, "That's fine work, Mr. Drummond." And he said, "Silas." And she said, "Silas." And there was a look between them that I turned away from because it was private and sacred and none of my business. He put the curtains back up. Alma's curtains, the ones he'd taken down and put in a trunk and shoved under the bed 2 years ago. He brought them out and washed them and hung them in the windows, and when Nessa saw them she understood exactly what they meant, and she didn't say a word about it, and that was one of the many things I came to admire about Nessa Calloway. She knew when silence was the kindest language. The courtship, if you could call it that, was the quietest thing I've ever witnessed between 2 grown people. Silas wasn't a man for grand gestures. He showed up. That was his language. He came to meals on time, and he spoke to her, and he listened to her, and he helped her carry water, and he asked about her day. And each of these small acts was, for Silas Drummond, the equivalent of another man riding up with an armload of wildflowers and a rented violin. Nessa received each one with the same steady grace. She didn't push. She didn't hurry. She let it come at the pace it needed, which was the pace of a man relearning how to be human after 2 years of trying not to be. The children bloomed. There's no other word for it. Josephine began talking again, really talking, with opinions and arguments and the kind of fierceness that delighted Nessa and occasionally alarmed Silas, who had not been prepared for a daughter with views on suffrage and the territory's grazing laws. Calvin stopped climbing onto roofs. He took to following me around the ranch, asking questions about cattle and horses and fence work, and he was useful, genuinely useful, and the anger went out of him like water out of a cracked bucket, slowly, quietly, until one day it was just gone. And Marguerite sang. Not just along with Nessa anymore, but on her own in the garden on the porch, walking to the chicken coop with a basket on her arm. She had a voice, that child. Clear and true and full of something that went beyond music into the territory of, well, I'm an old cattleman and I don't have the words for it, but I'll say this. When Marguerite Drummond sang, you stopped what you were doing and you listened, and you felt something in your chest that had been sleeping, and you were grateful. Nessa taught her songs. Real songs, not just nursery rounds, hymns and ballads and a few that sounded like they came from farther back than Pennsylvania. Old songs with minor keys and words about rivers and hills, and people going away and coming home. Marguerite learned them all, and she sang them in the kitchen while Nessa cooked, and sometimes Josephine joined in, and sometimes, once, twice. Then more often, Silas stood in the doorway and listened with an expression on his face that was so close to peace it made my old heart ache. The proposal was the most Silas thing imaginable. They were on the porch one evening, October by then, the first frost on the ground, the light going fast, and the children were inside and I was crossing the yard to the barn, and I heard Silas say, "Miss Calloway." "Nessa," she said, and I could hear the patience in it, the gentle correction she'd been making for 2 months. "Nessa," he paused, "I've been thinking. About what kind of man lets a woman work in his house for 4 months and sleep under his roof and raise his children, and doesn't have the decency to ask her to be his wife." Silence. Long enough that I stopped walking and stood there like an old fool in the dark yard with my heart in my throat. "A scared man," Nessa said softly. "A good man who's scared. I'm asking now. I know you are. Will you? Will I what Silas?" And there was something in her voice, not cruelty, not coyness, just a quiet insistence that the words be said, all of them, out loud in the air between them, because she had earned that much. "Will you marry me, Nessa Calloway? Not because the children need a mother, though they do, and not because the house needs keeping, though it does, but because he stopped. He was not good at this. Because the house isn't warm because of the stove. It's warm because of you, and I'd like it to stay warm, and I'd like you to stay." She was quiet for so long that I almost walked over there and shook her. Then she said, "I'll stay, Silas." And that was it. No embrace that I saw, no kiss. They were private people and the porch was not the place. But I heard the silence after, and it was the fullest silence I've ever heard. And I went to the barn and I sat on a hay bale and I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes, and I will tell you now, at the age of 55, I was not crying. I was not. A man can have dust in his eyes in a barn in October, and that's all it was. They married in the Shallow Creek church 3 weeks later. Josephine stood beside Nessa and held the flowers. Calvin stood beside his father and tried to look bored and failed. Marguerite held Nessa's hand through the entire ceremony and did not let go, and when the minister said the words and it was done, Marguerite looked up at Nessa and said, so quietly that only Nessa and I heard it because I was standing close, "Now you can't leave." And Nessa looked down at this child, this stubborn, brown-eyed, singing child who had grabbed her hand on a Sunday morning and held on until the world arranged itself around that grip, and she said, "I never intended to." That was 14 years ago. I'm 69 now. I still work the Drummond Ranch, though Silas tells me every spring that I should retire to a chair on the porch and let the young men handle the cattle, and every spring I tell him I'll retire when the cattle do. Josephine is 24 and teaches school in Paxley. Teaches it well, I'm told. The way a woman teaches who learned from someone who knew how. Calvin runs the South Pasture and is better with a horse than any man I've trained, and he married a girl from Shallow Creek last year, and they're expecting their first child in the spring. And Marguerite is 19 and sings. Sings in the church, sings at the socials, sings on the porch in the evening while Nessa hums along, and the sound carries across the yard to the barn where I sit and listen and remember. Silas is different. Not a different man, the man he always was underneath the grief, the man Alma married and Nessa saw through 2 years of ice to find. He's still gruff, still quiet, still more comfortable with a fence post than a sentence. But the wall is down and has been down for 14 years, and the house is warm, and the curtains are in the windows, and there's bread baking in the kitchen, and on certain evenings when the light is right and the work is done, you can stand in the yard of the Drummond Ranch and hear two women singing in the kitchen, one voice low and steady and one voice clear and true. And you can hear, if you listen, a man's low rough hum joining in from the porch, and that sound, that particular sound, is the sound of a house that came back to life. I've been asked over the years what I think happened, as if it were a mystery that needed solving, how Silas Drummond, who had locked his heart in a trunk with his dead wife's curtains, came to love again. People want a moment. They want the scene where the music swells and the man falls to his knees and the woman weeps and everything changes in a heartbeat. It wasn't like that. It was slower and harder and quieter than that. It was a woman who came to a cold house and warmed it without asking permission. It was a voice that filled a kitchen and 3 children who knew what that voice meant before their father did. It was biscuits that tasted like mama's. It was a splinted arm and a braided rope and a rag doll on the floor by the stove. It was a man's hands shaking in a tack room, because the wall was cracking and he couldn't stop it, and part of him didn't want to. And it was a 5-year-old girl who grabbed a stranger's hand on the steps of a ranch house and held on until her father opened his eyes. That's all it was. That's everything it was.